The mist clung to the craggy cliffs of the Blue Mountains like a ghostly shroud, tendrils of grey vapour withering between outcrops of stone and the gnarly limbs of ancient pines. Somewhere, high above, the peaks were obscured entirely, lost in the opaque haze. Down in the valley, the world felt muffled, sounds dampened as if the mist itself had substance. I glanced over at Chris as we hiked along the narrow trail, taking in the cocksure grin on his face. He looked invigorated by the atmosphere, his keen blue eyes darting around, alert for adventure. Me? I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. The mist distorted distances, eroded edges, blurred the familiar into something alien. We might as well have been walking through a dreamscape or a nightmare.
Admit it, this is awesome.
Chris said, taking a deep breath of the damp air.
The mist just adds to the atmosphere, makes it feel primal, you know? Like we've gone back in time, about to stumble onto something no one's seen for centuries.
I nodded, though his enthusiasm failed to diminish my unease. Chris had always loved immersing himself in the unknown, letting his imagination run wild. Me, I preferred the comfort of certainty. The mist represented the opposite, a void, a blank page where anything could be drawn. We came to a bend in the trail, the rock wall cutting off sharply to reveal a vista of more stone and twisted pines, all painted in various hues of grey by the persistent mist. Chris let out a low whistle as he took it all in.
Now that's a view, mist or no mist. Can you imagine what this looks like on a clear day? Jutting rocks, endless sky, trees for miles.
His voice trailed off as his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze, squinting. There was a dark, angular shape nestled between two towering pines 100 metres off the trail. Chris was already on his way, his eagerness unmistakable. With a quiet sigh, I followed. The shape emerged from the gloom as we drew closer, a small dilapidated wooden shack tucked against the base of the cliffside. Time and the elements had not been kind to it, shingles missing like patches of thinning hair. The walls leaned at an angle no carpenter would approve of. The windows were murky with grime and cobwebs. Chris whistled again, this time in awe.
Old abandoned places have the best energy. I bet no one set foot here for decades. We have to check it out.
My skin prickled as I stared up at the crumbling structure.
I don't know if that's a good idea. We shouldn't mess with it.
Chris clapped me on the back.
Where's your sense of adventure? This is a goldmine of atmosphere. Let's just look around quickly.
Before I could protest further, he was already pushing through the weathered wooden door hanging crookedly from one rusted hinge. With a frustrated huff, I followed him inside. The interior of the shack smelled of mildew, dust, and antiquity. Dim shafts of grey light filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating scattered debris, a moth-eaten wool coat, yellowed newspapers from another era, an overturned tin cup. A thick layer of dust coated every surface. The place looked like a time capsule, long forgotten. Chris circled the main room, running his hands over the everything as if to absorb the history through his fingertips. When he spoke, his voice was hushed, reverent.
Can't you feel it, Taylor? There's something special about this place. Hidden history, stories wanting to be told.
I felt something alright, but special wasn't quite the word for it. The back of my neck prickled as if cool fingers troweled all over my skin. The shadows seemed to waver and stretch, even though no movement to prompt them. Each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet was amplified, setting my nerves on edge. Chris peered down a narrow corridor to another room, in the shack's rear.
Let's see what else is back there.
I grabbed his arm before he could wander deeper into the musty dimness.
I really think we should head back. We've pushed our luck enough.
Chris just smiled.
Scared, Taylor?
I could feel my cheeks flush. Chris knew I hated seeming cowardly, which is why he often used that word to goad me into following his lead. With a hard swallow, I released his arm and gestured for him to proceed down the corridor. I saw the gleam of victory in his eyes before he turned and headed into the gloom. The back room was even smaller than the front, with no windows to relieve the claustrophobic blackness. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the thin beam over decrepit wooden shelves, more rusted cans, and a few scattered tools. Chris reached out to pick up a coil of yellow rope when a sharp, sudden creak made us both freeze. My flashlight swung toward the source before I could think to stop. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a human being shape standing hunched in the corner, a pale face peering out from beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Then the light passed over the emptiness, just a trick of nerves and shadows. Chris's chuckle sounded forced.
Gotta love creepy old buildings. I think we should head out, though.
I didn't need any convincing. We hurried back down the corridor toward daylight, both walking a little faster than was necessary. Stepping back into the open mountain air felt liberating, like escaping the tightness of a tomb. The mist had thickened in the time we'd been inside, reducing visibility to less than 30 meters now. I glanced at my watch. It was getting late.
We should really start heading back if we want to make it out before nightfall.
Chris scuffed his boot against a rock, looking surprisingly indecisive.
Actually, I was thinking maybe we could camp somewhere around here tonight, head back at dawn. When are we going to have a chance like this again? Out here all alone, the mist, that awesomely creepy shack.
I stared at him suspiciously.
Here, overnight. Are you crazy?
Maybe a little. But where's the harm? We've got our gear. The shack makes a perfect ready-made shelter. Come on, Taylor, live a little. This will make for an incredible story down the road.
I hated the thought of spending the night out here, but Chris had his mindset now, and I knew from experience he wouldn't let it go easily. Part of me was tempted too, despite the edginess gnawing at my thoughts. I had to admit, there was a dark lure to this place.
Alright,
I conceded.
but we leave at sunrise. No arguments.
The grin on Chris's face was infectious. As reckless ideas went, I guess there was worse ones. With the last rays of daylight rapidly fading, we quickly gathered tinder and made a fire pit just outside the shack's door. Once we had a small fire crackling, we unrolled our sleeping bags inside, near the front room's window where we had a view of the flames. We brought provisions, so we ate a quick meal as darkness fell fully over the mountains, bringing with an amplified solitude. The inside of the shack looked even eerier at night, shadows pooling thickly in every corner, the fire cast flickering orange light through the windows, uneven glass, making the walls seem to undulate. I lay atop my sleeping bag, eyes tracing the warped ceiling boards and trying not to imagine them detaching and dropping onto us. Chris seemed unfazed, already reclining and looking thoroughly at peace.
See, Taylor? This is incredible.
He sighed happily, hands laced behind his head.
Just the two of us out here, the world shut out. Can't you feel the vibe?
I made a non-committal sound, resisting the urge to glance around the shadowy room again. Chris chuckled.
Still worried about ghosts? Don't worry, I'll protect you.
I forced a laugh in return, hoping Chris was right about just being atmospherics. With the fire still crackling outside, my friend's steady breathing next to me, and sheer exhaustion, I finally felt myself starting to relax. I let my eyelids sink closed, welcoming the embrace of sleep. I jerked awake sometime later, instantly awake. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the shack's interior murky. Chris remained sound asleep in his own cocoon. Nothing seemed outwardly amiss, but some instinct had triggered my waking. I lay still, straining my ears against the darkness. Then I heard it. The sound of something striking the outside of the wooden walls, slowly at first, then faster, more insistent. Adrenaline flooded my veins. I elbowed Chris urgently.
Chris, wake up. There's something out there.
He inhaled sharply as my elbow connected, blinking around sleepily before focusing on my face.
Huh? What's going on?
I gestured toward the wall.
Listen.
We lay side by side in silence. Chris's eyes widened, traces of sleep vanishing.
What the hell is that?
I just shook my head, at a loss. Chris fumbled for his flashlight, flicking it on. The thin beam illuminated nothing but dust swirling through the air. The tapping continued, unabated.
I'm going out to look.
Chris,
I protested, but he was already out of his sleeping bag. I watched the flashlight's bobbing glow vanish through the doorway, then swept my own light out around the empty room. The tapping sounded louder with him gone, crisper. I imagined splintering wood as whatever was outside increased the force of its assault. After a few agonising minutes, Chris's beam reappeared. He held a finger to his lips before speaking in a hushed tone.
Didn't see anything. Walked all around just now. Must be a tree branch or something.
Maybe he believed that, but I could tell from the tight set of his shoulders that he was more unnerved than he was letting on. We sat quietly as the tapping slowly subsided back into silence. The quiet somehow felt fuller than before, as if the unknown source's attention had shifted from the wall to us. A cold trickle of unease inched down my spine. Beside me, Chris let out a strained chuckle.
Fun atmosphere, huh?
I didn't answer. I strained to hear anything else over the roaring of blood in my ears. Had that been the wind? A branch? Some nocturnal creature? Or something more menacing? Something that had noticed us trespassing into its domain? A flicker of shadow in the corner of my eye made me jump. Chris shifted closer until his shoulder pressed against mine.
Let's try to get a little more rest.
I nodded, knowing there would be no more sleep for me that night. The next hour passed tensely but quietly. If Chris dozed, it was lightly. I lay rigid, senses hyper alert for the tapping's return, but nothing disturbed the silence. The last embers faded from the fire, leaving us in near total darkness. My flashlight lay between us, Chris's hand resting atop it like a talisman. I'd almost convinced myself it was over. The creak of a floorboard from somewhere in the shack's rear. Chris bolted upright this time, fumbling the flashlight on. He swept it toward the corridor. Our twin beams illuminated the narrow passage, emptiness taunting us from the dark. Chris swung his light toward me.
You heard that too, right?
I felt the cold drop in my stomach before I consciously registered why. The creak had come from the back room, the one we thought was empty. Adrenaline flooded my system once again, every instinct screaming danger. Not wanting to voice my fear aloud, I grabbed Chris' arm and pulled him toward the doorway. He came willingly. Panic widened his eyes. We hurried out into the night without a backward glance. Outside, the mist still clung to the trees and rocks. The dying fire shed little light through its haze. I expected the tapping sounds to start up again, any second. For some unseen followed a rush from the shack's doorway, but nothing came. Still, neither of us suggested going back inside. We sat with our backs against the cold stone of the cliffside, facing the decrepit building, waiting for what I wasn't sure I wanted to know.
Maybe this wasn't the best idea after all.
Chris breathed out, his lame attempt at humour doing nothing to cut the tension. I didn't respond. The toe of my boot dug slowly through the loose dirt and gravel beneath us. Stones, that was all. Just stones, and I gasped as my toe abruptly hit something smooth and hard beneath the soil. Chris glanced over.
What?
I began scooping away more dirt in front of us. After a few inches, the object was exposed. A yellowed human skull, its empty eye sockets gazing vacantly past us. We both scrambled aback, on instinct.
It's probably just some unmarked grave or something, like maybe there used to be an old cemetery here.
He didn't sound convinced. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the skull. A normal day in the mountains was one thing. Human remains changed the vibe. My mind conjured images of makeshift burial sites, of missing hikers never located, of malevolent things that made prey disappear. I barely noticed dawn's first glow brightening the mist until Chris shook my shoulder with palpable relief.
It's almost sunrise. Time to get the hell out of here.
We left the skull where we unearthed it, gathering our gear with shaking hands. As the mist began burning off under daylight, I felt a surge of hope. We'd leave this place behind, shroud it back in obscurity, let the mountains reclaim their secrets. We set off down the trail quickly, mist smoking off around us in the rising sun. Within minutes we rounded a bend, leaving the shack and its plateau behind us for good. Or so we thought. I frowned at the craggy outcropping as we passed.
Hold on. I think we've seen that formation already.
Chris paused, glancing back.
It can't be. We've stuck to the main trail.
Unease trickled down my spine.
I'm sure of it. Look, you can see that shack again from here.
He followed my pointed finger. Dread widened his eyes. There was no mistaking it now. Impossibly, we were back at the plateau's edge, the shack waiting like a patient predator. Chris turned on his heel, jaw clenched.
Let's just keep moving. Must have gotten turned around.
We walked faster now, ignoring the fatigue in our legs, but as the surrounding scenery began repeating itself over and over, a sickening realization sank in. No matter which direction we chose, we ended up back at our starting point, like ants caught in a sadistic child's maze, like rats in a trap. Panic swelled in my chest. The shack seemed to loom larger with each appearance, as if its hold over the landscape was strengthening. Part of me wanted to give in, to turn back towards its doorway and the horrors waiting inside. Maybe we had trespassed somewhere we weren't meant to leave. Beside me, Chris stopped short, his eyes fixed ahead.
Oh God, Taylor, tell me I'm seeing things.
I followed his stunned gaze and felt the air freeze in my lungs. There, between two pines framing the trail, was a figure. Patches of brown leather clothing hung off its lean body. A tattered wide-brimmed hat sat low over its face, arms that seemed far too long, ending in clenched fists. And despite the distance between us, I could make out the gleam of its eyes within the shattered hat brim, eyes that held dark intent. The figure stood motionless, watching, waiting, just like the shack. They both wanted us to come back voluntarily, to cede control, to acknowledge that we were trapped.
Run!
I choked out, shoving a paralysed Chris forward. We bolted down the trail, no longer caring if we headed deeper into the mountains. I risked a backward glance as we sprinted. The tall figure remained where we'd left it, a silent sentinel guiding us back toward damnation. The shack loomed ahead once more, seeming larger and more decayed than ever. We blew past it, racing for the tree line. The forest welcomed us with grasping arms, pine branches tearing at our clothes and skin like clawed hands. Our footfalls crunched over dead leaves and forest debris as we wove between twisted trunks. No trail, no direction, just the need to get away. When we finally collapsed past two gnarled pines, grasping for breaths, the shack was nowhere in sight. No plateau, no barren cliffs, just silent, ancient forest. Had we escaped? Chris shook his head as if trying to detach a clinging cobweb.
That wasn't some atmospheric ghost story shit. This place is wrong. We need to keep moving.
I nodded, not yet trusting my voice. Without discussion, we adjusted course, picking our way roughly west. Eventually, the trees began thinning ahead. We pushed through a final wall of underbrush and stumbled on a gravel parking lot containing a few beat-up trucks. My knees nearly buckled in relief. Beyond the lot stretched a two-lane road winding down away from the mountains safely. We hurried across the lot, feet crunching on the gravel. No mist crept from the forest depths to reclaim its prey. We had made it. I reached for the passenger door of an old pickup, not caring that it didn't belong to us. We just needed to get the hell away from that damned plateau. My fingers froze an inch from the handle. From the trees rang two voices. Faint, but instantly familiar. Our own.
Chris, Taylor, where are you? Come back.
The blood drained from my face. Beside me, Chris went corpse pale.
But how? We're right here. We got away.
The echoes around voices pleaded and enticed from the tree line. I took an involuntary step back towards the woods before catching myself. It was a trick, some twisted illusion.
Don't listen to it.
I urged, grabbing Chris's arms with frightened strength.
We need to go. Now.
Chris nodded jerkingly, eyes still wide with confusion and horror. After a few tries, I managed to wrench the trunk door open for us to climb inside. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the wires stripped to hotwire the ignition. Meanwhile, our distant voices grew more urgent, reverberating through the trees.
Come find us! We're lost! Help!
Chris's breathing came in panic gulps. I laid a steadying hand on his shoulder, as much to reassure myself as him.
They're not real. Just listen for the engine.
With a final spark, the truck rumbled to life beneath us. I floored the gas before I could even close my door, spraying gravel behind us as we caneered onto the road. The mountain woods blurred past, receding into hazy impressions of green and brown. Still, these phantom voices clung to the edges of hearing, towers of a predator we couldn't fully escape. Only once we reached the outskirts of the nearest town did they finally fade, merging back into the shadows where they belonged. Away from the ancient woods, reality stabilized again, solid, firm, governed by unchanging laws. But we now knew there are other places, pockets outside the rules where more primal forces hold dominion, places guarded and shaped by something patient and cunning, something waiting eagerly for those who wander too far from the path. We'd escaped their shack's grasp, but what scars had we taken with us? What had we brought back? I glanced at Chris, seeing my own hollowness reflected in his eyes. He looked haunted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. I knew we were both thinking the same thing, wondering if we'd left some vital, untouchable piece of ourselves behind on that accursed plateau.